But today I want to focus on one aspect of American life that remains particularly skewed by race and by wealth, a source of inequity that has ripple effects on families and on communities and ultimately on our nation. And that is our criminal justice system. Now, this is not a new topic. I know sometimes folks discover these things like they just happen. There's a long history of inequity in the criminal justice system in America. When I was in the state legislature in Illinois, we worked to make sure that we had videotaping of interrogations because there were some problems there. We set up racial profiling laws to prevent the kind of bias in traffic stops that too many people experience. Since my first campaign, I've talked about how in too many cases our criminal justice system ends up being a pipeline from underfunded, inadequate schools to overcrowded jails. What has changed, though, is that in recent years, the eyes of more Americans have been opened to this truth, partly because of cameras, partly because of tragedy, partly because the statistics cannot be ignored. We can't close our eyes anymore. And the good news, and this is truly good news, is that good people of all political persuasions are starting to think we need to do something about this. So let's look at the statistics. The United States is home to 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's prisoners. Think about that. Our incarceration rate is 4 times higher than China's. We keep more people behind bars than the top 35 European countries combined. And it hasn't always been the case, this huge explosion in incarceration rates. In 1980, there were 500,000 people behind bars in America. 500,000 people in 1980. I was in college in 1980. Many of you were not born in 1980, that's okay. I remember 1980, 500,000. Today, there are 2.2 million. It has quadrupled since 1980. Our prison population has doubled in the last 2 decades alone. Now, we need to be honest. There are a lot of folks who belong in prison. If we're gonna deal with this problem and the inequities involved, then we also have to speak honestly. There are some folks who need to be in jail. They may have had terrible things happen to them in their lives. We hold out the hope for redemption, but they've done some bad things. Murderers, predators, rapists, gang leaders, drug kingpins. We need some of those folks behind bars. Our communities are safer thanks to brave police officers and hardworking prosecutors who put those violent criminals in jail. And the studies show that up to a certain point, tougher prosecutors and stiffer sentences for these violent offenders contributed to the decline in violent crime over the last few decades. Although the science also indicates that you get a point of diminishing returns. But it is important for us to recognize that violence in our communities is serious, and that historically, in fact, the African American community oftentimes was under-policed rather than over-policed. Folks were very interested in containing the African American community so it couldn't leave segregated areas, but within those areas, there wasn't enough police presence. But here's the thing. Over the last few decades, we've also locked up more and more nonviolent drug offenders than ever before for longer than ever before. And that is the real reason our prison population is so high. In far too many cases, the punishment simply does not fit the crime. If you're a low-level drug dealer or you violate your parole, you owe some debt to society. You have to be held accountable and make amends. But you don't owe 20 years. You don't owe a life sentence. That's disproportionate to the price that should be paid. And by the way, the taxpayers are picking up the tab for that price. Every year we spend $80 billion to keep folks incarcerated. $80 billion. Now, just to put that in perspective, for $80 billion, we could have universal preschool for every 3-year-old and 4-year-old in America. That's what $80 billion buys. For $80 billion, we could double the salary of every high school teacher in America. For $80 billion, we could finance new roads and new bridges and new airports, job training programs, research and development. We're about to get into a big budget debate in Washington, what I couldn't do with $80 billion. It's a lot of money. For what we spend to keep everyone locked up for 1 year, we could eliminate tuition at every single one of our public colleges and universities. As Republican Senator and presidential candidate Rand Paul has said. No, and to his credit, he's been consistent on this issue. Imprisoning large numbers of nonviolent drug offenders for long periods of time costs the taxpayers money without making them any safer. Roughly 1/3 of the Justice Department's budget now goes toward incarceration. 1/3. And there are outstanding public servants at our Justice Department, starting with our outstanding Attorney General, Loretta Lynch. And we've got some great prosecutors here today. And they do outstanding work, so many of them. But every dollar they have to spend keeping nonviolent drug offenders in prison is a dollar they can't spend going after drug kingpins, or tracking down terrorists, or hiring more police, and giving them the resources that would allow them to do a more effective job community policing. And then, of course, there are the costs that can't be measured in dollars and cents. Because the statistics on who gets incarcerated show that by a wide margin, it disproportionately impacts communities of color. African Americans and Latinos make up 30% of our population. They make up 60% of our inmates. About 1 in every 35 African American men, 1 in every 88 Latino men is serving time right now. Among white men, that number is 1 in 214. The bottom line is that in too many places, black boys and black men, Latino boys and Latino men, experience being treated differently under the law.
The land of the free has the biggest prison population in the history of mankind. And how did that happen? When I was a kid, there were a few 100,000 people in prison in the United States. Governor Ronald Reagan in California was proudly shutting down prisons. Reagan was responsible for an inmate Bill of Rights. And yet, in the last 30 years, there's been a total transformation of the American prison system. Today, there are about 2.2 million people behind bars in the United States, more than in communist China. I've been going into prisons for the last 20 years. And who have I met behind bars? Well, there are murderers and armed robbers and rapists and child molesters. But the majority of people behind bars are nonviolent offenders. About 2/3 of them are African American or Latino. They're overwhelmingly poor, substance abusers, a large number of mental patients, huge rates of illiteracy. So whereas 30 years ago in the United States we were building low-income housing, today we're building prisons as a form of low-income housing. There's about 200,000 women behind bars, overwhelmingly nonviolent, many of them in prison because their spouses or their boyfriends were drug dealers and they wouldn't rat them out. And there are tens of thousands of people who are in solitary confinement. Some of them are major gang leaders, some of them are people who are violent, and it makes sense to put them in solitary. But the majority aren't, and they're prey to all kinds of health problems, psychological problems, being locked away for weeks, months, years, by themselves in a cell, only allowed out for 2 hours, maybe, a day. For most of these nonviolent offenders, there are so many other less expensive ways to deal with them in the community. For example, mental patients. We used to have mental patients in mental hospitals, and then we shut down the mental hospitals. So now they're in prison. The largest single facility for mental patients in the United States is the LA County Jail. And it is so much more expensive to incarcerate people with mental illness than to treat them in the community. In the United States, we're privatizing our prisons and giving them to corporations to make money off of locking people up. All of this is relevant in Great Britain because Great Britain is the only country in the Western industrialized world that's imitating American correctional practices. Great Britain has one of the largest prison populations in Europe, overcrowded facilities. There have been major cutbacks in staffing in Great Britain, rise in private corrections. And the other thing that's being imitated here is the whole notion of having large prison facilities. You're building facilities here with 1,000 inmates. It's exactly the wrong way to build and manage a prison. So why is it so important to look at prisons? Why is it so important what you're doing to the people who are locked away? Most of them will walk free one day. Most of them will be on the streets, in the malls, with people. And what you do to them behind bars has consequences. But beyond that, what motivates my work on prisons and the American prison system is the notion that if you really want to understand a society, look at how it treats the people at the very bottom. And that's who you'll find in America's prisons.